The millionaire's mother begged in silence for her daughter-in-law to stop the abuse. The maid, a witness to everything, risked it all to protect her. But what no one expected was the son's return at that exact moment. As he enters the room, he sees the scene, and the fallen wooden rod says everything. If this story interests you, don't forget to subscribe to our channel and tell us which city you are watching us from. Let's continue. In a prestigious neighborhood on the Upper East Side of Manhattan, where buildings rose like fortresses of glass and concrete, shielding their residents from the chaos of the metropolis, there was a penthouse that shined under the afternoon sun, with the same intensity as the jewels kept in its safes. There, every object told a story of conquest, every piece of imported furniture whispered of international travels, and every painting on the walls celebrated the success of a family that had learned to turn ambition into fortune. But behind that impeccable facade, where silence was bought with gold and linen curtains, blocked not only the light but also the curious eyes of the outside world, there were secrets that no amount of money could completely hide. Mary Sullivan was 28 years old when she first stepped into the entrance hall of that penthouse, carrying only an old suitcase and a heart full of hope. Coming from the historic heart of Savannah, Georgia, she had left behind a simple life where cobblestone streets told stories of centuries and where everyone knew each other by name. New York City received her with indifference, as it did millions of others who arrived in search of a chance. But Mary was not like the others. She possessed something rare in that world of appearances, a genuine ability to see beyond the masks people wore. Mrs. Eleanor Sterling was 73 years old and had a history that few knew in full. Born into a traditional family in Charleston, South Carolina, she had married young to a shipping magnate, building alongside him an empire that survived economic crises, political shifts, and financial storms. A widow for 15 years, she saw in the solidity of that apartment not just the result of decades of work, but also the constant memory of a love that no longer warmed her nights. Her white hair was always kept in an elegant bun, and her blue eyes, which once shone with the intensity of a dreamer, now carried the weariness of one who had lived too much and trusted too little. In the first few days, Mary quickly learned the unwritten rules of that house. She knew that the Italian marble floors of the main hallway betrayed any heavy footstep, that the office door creaked slightly when opened slowly, and that Mrs. Eleanor's room always smelled of lavender and loneliness. She also learned that her employer liked to have green tea at 3 in the afternoon, that she preferred the windows open even on cold days, and that she loved hearing stories about life in the South, as if Mary's every account were a window into a world she herself had lost long ago. The routine established itself naturally. Mary woke up at 6 in the morning, prepared breakfast with the care of someone who knows that small gestures carry great meaning, organized Mrs. Eleanor's medications in small compartments labeled by time, and dedicated her afternoons to conversations that went far beyond the protocol between employer and employee. They talked about old recipes, about the changes in the city, about how time seemed to run differently when one had company. And Mrs. Eleanor gradually began to smile more, to walk with less fear through the wide rooms, to feel that the house was becoming a home again. Edward Sterling, Mrs. Eleanor's only son, was a 45-year-old man who carried on his shoulders the weight of keeping a business empire running in difficult times. Tall, with an elegant bearing and graying hair at his temples that gave him an air of seriousness, he divided his time between endless meetings, business trips, and calls that never ended. Mary saw him little, usually during quick weekends when he appeared for lunch with his mother, always checking his phone, always hurried, always with his mind elsewhere. But she noticed something in him that few did, a silent guilt that lingered in his eyes every time he looked at Mrs. Eleanor, as if he knew he was failing at something fundamental, but lacked the courage or time to correct it. It was on an April morning, when autumn began to cool the streets of New York, that Edward announced a business trip to Singapore. 3 weeks evaluating expansion possibilities for the company, meetings with international investors, diplomatic dinners. Mrs. Eleanor merely nodded, accustomed to her son's absences, but Mary noticed a slight tremor in her hands as she held her teacup. There was something in the air, a tension she couldn't name, but it made her stomach tighten. The bigger news, however, came shortly after. Camilla Vance Sterling, Edward's wife, would be responsible for supervising Mrs. Eleanor's care during his absence. The news fell over the apartment like a cold shadow. Mary had never spent much time with Camilla. The woman appeared sporadically, always impeccable in her designer clothes, her high heels echoing through the hallway like announcements of authority, and her expensive perfume seeming more like a chemical barrier than a scent. At 38, Camilla had the cold beauty of someone who had learned early on to use appearance as a tool of power. Married to Edward for 10 years, she came from a family of politicians in Washington, D.C., where alliances were built with strategic smiles and friendships were measured by what they could yield. The marriage had been, for many, a perfect union, his money, her contacts. But for those who watched closely, it was clear that the relationship had the depth of a postcard, beautiful on the surface and empty inside. Mrs. Eleanor never hid her discomfort with her daughter-in-law. It wasn't explicit hostility, but a polite distance, a carefulness not to be left alone with her for long, a gaze that shifted away when Camilla entered the room. Mary had noticed in recent months how the elderly woman withdrew whenever her daughter-in-law visited, how her smile became forced, how her responses became monosyllabic. And there was more, small incidents that accumulated like clouds before a storm. 3 months ago, Mary had found Mrs. Eleanor crying quietly in her room after a visit from Camilla. When asked what had happened, the elderly woman simply shook her head and said everything was fine, that it was just tiredness. But Mary saw the red mark on her arm as if someone had held it too tightly. 2 weeks later, during a family lunch, Camilla made comments about how Mrs. Eleanor was becoming forgetful, suggesting in front of everyone that perhaps it was time to consider an assisted living facility where she would have more specialized care. The awkward silence that followed was only broken by Edward, who quickly changed the subject, but not before Mary saw the expression of panic on Mrs. Eleanor's face. There were also the small cruelties disguised as concern. Camilla had a habit of criticizing her mother-in-law's clothing choices, saying certain colors made her look older or that certain styles weren't appropriate for someone her age. She questioned her memories, correcting dates and names with a tone of condescension that made Mrs. Eleanor doubt herself. And always, there was that icy stare that seemed to evaluate the elderly woman not as a person, but as a problem to be solved. Mary realized she wasn't the only one who noticed. Edward, in his brief moments of presence, seemed uncomfortable with the interactions between his wife and mother, but he always chose silence, perhaps out of convenience, perhaps out of fear of facing a truth that would require difficult decisions. He was good at solving business problems, closing million-dollar contracts and predicting market trends. But when it came to reading the subtleties of family relationships, he preferred to believe that everything was fine, that the tensions were normal, that time would resolve them. On the eve of the trip, while Edward was packing in the office, Camilla appeared at the apartment earlier than usual. Mary was helping Mrs. Eleanor get ready for lunch when she heard the unmistakable sound of high heels in the hallway. The elderly woman stiffened immediately, and Mary felt the change in the atmosphere, as if the temperature had dropped 10 degrees. Camilla entered the room without knocking, like someone who already felt like the owner of the space. She was stunning in a navy blue suit that highlighted her slender silhouette, her perfectly brushed blonde hair falling over her shoulders, her impeccable makeup highlighting her green eyes. But it was her smile that caused the most discomfort, a smile that didn't reach her eyes, looking rehearsed to hide intentions she didn't want to reveal. "Eleanor, dear, how are you? Edward asked me to stop by and ensure everything will be perfect while he's away. You know how he worries about you." The voice was sweet, almost syrupy, but Mary noticed the rigidity in Mrs. Eleanor's shoulders, the way she lightly gripped the arm of the chair she was sitting in. "I'm fine, Camilla. Mary takes very good care of me. There's no need for concern." "Oh, I know Mary is dedicated." The daughter-in-law cast a quick glance at the maid, a look that evaluated and dismissed her simultaneously. "But 3 weeks is a long time. Edward would feel more at ease knowing I'm personally supervising. After all, you're not getting any younger, and certain things can happen." The comment hung in the air like a veiled threat. Mary swallowed hard, feeling a growing urgency to protect Mrs. Eleanor, but without knowing exactly from what. There was nothing explicit in Camilla's speech, nothing that could be pointed to as aggression. It was all subtle, calculated, poisoned with kindness. "I appreciate your concern," Mrs. Eleanor said, with a voice that tried to sound firm but trembled at the edges. "But as I said, I am well cared for." Camilla smiled again, that smile that warmed nothing. "Of course, Eleanor, of course. I just want to make sure everything is in order. You understand, don't you? It's about family responsibility." After Camilla left, Mrs. Eleanor remained in silence for long minutes. Mary approached slowly and held her hand, feeling how it trembled. "Are you all right, ma'am?" Mrs. Eleanor looked at her with eyes that carried decades of experience, of losses, of silent battles. "Mary, promise me you'll stay close, okay? No matter what happens, stay close to me. I promise, Mrs. Eleanor, I promise." But as the afternoon turned into night and the apartment plunged into the artificial stillness of the protected neighborhood, Mary felt that the promise would be tested in ways she couldn't yet imagine. Something was forming in that house, a storm disguised as calm, and she had the terrible certainty that as soon as Edward boarded for the other side of the world, the masks would fall and Camilla's true face would be revealed. While helping Mrs. Eleanor to bed, observing how the elderly woman closed her eyes with an expression of exhaustion that went beyond the physical, Mary made a silent decision. No matter what happened, no matter the consequences, she would not allow anything bad to happen to this woman who had welcomed her, not just as a maid, but as someone worthy of respect and affection. And if that meant facing Camilla, facing fear, facing even the risk of losing everything she had built in New York, then so be it. Because some battles, Mary knew, were not chosen. They simply arrived, demanding that we take a side. And hers was already decided, even if the price of that decision was still a mystery, shrouded in the shadows of what was to come. The morning Edward left for Singapore dawned grey over Manhattan. Low clouds covered the skyscrapers like a heavy shroud, and traffic was already starting to congest the main avenues when the executive car arrived to pick him up. Mary had woken up earlier than usual, a restlessness in her chest that hadn't let her sleep properly through the night. While she prepared breakfast, her hands worked on autopilot, but her mind was completely focused on Mrs. Eleanor, who was still sleeping in the room, at the end of the hallway. Edward came down with his suitcases ready, his suit impeccable even at that hour of the morning, his phone already glued to his ear resolving some last-minute issue. He had that mechanical efficiency of someone who lives in constant motion, always one step ahead of the present, always planning the next commitment. Mary served the coffee and watched as he drank it quickly, still talking on the phone, gesturing with his free hand, completely absorbed in his corporate world. When he finally hung up, he looked at Mary with an expression that mixed gratitude and guilt. "Mary, take good care of my mother. You know how fragile she is. Any problem, call me immediately. It doesn't matter the time zone, nothing. If you need me, I'll come back." "Don't you worry, Mr. Sterling. Mrs. Eleanor is in good hands." He nodded, but there was something in his eyes that Mary couldn't quite decipher. Perhaps it was worry, perhaps remorse for leaving his mother, or perhaps an uneasy feeling about leaving Camilla in charge. But he said nothing more. He just took his bags and headed for the door. Mrs. Eleanor appeared. In the hallway at that moment, still in her robe, her white hair loose over her shoulders, her expression sleepy but heavy with a contained sadness. Edward approached, kissed his mother's forehead with genuine tenderness, and whispered something Mary couldn't hear. The elderly woman just nodded, trying to smile, but the smile didn't reach her eyes. When the door closed behind him, the silence that took over the apartment was different. It was as if something had been removed, an invisible protection that now left the space more vulnerable. Mrs. Eleanor stood still for a few seconds, looking at the closed door, and then sighed deeply. "He was always like this, Mary. Always running, always busy. When he was a child, I used to joke that he was in a hurry to grow up. Now I see he's in a hurry to live, but he forgets to stop and actually feel life." Mary gently held the elderly woman's arm, guiding her back inside. "Let's have a nice breakfast, Mrs. Eleanor. I made that pound cake you like so much." The morning passed with a deceptive calm. They had breakfast together on the balcony, watching the city wake up below, the buildings slowly emerging from the morning mist. Mrs. Eleanor told stories of when Edward was a child, of how he used to play in that same apartment when it was just a smaller space, before the renovations and expansions that money allowed. There was nostalgia in her voice, but also a melancholy that weighed on every word, as if she knew those simple days would never return. It was only in the early afternoon that Camilla appeared. Mary first heard the sound of the key in the lock, then the decisive footsteps in the entrance hall. She was helping Mrs. Eleanor do some light physical therapy exercises, movements the doctor had recommended to maintain mobility, when the daughter-in-law entered the room. Camilla was different, still elegant, still impeccable, but there was something in her posture that was more assertive, more proprietorial. She wore a white suit that contrasted with her blonde hair and carried a folder of documents and a large leather bag. "Good afternoon, Eleanor. I came to see how you are and organize a few things. Edward gave me a list of pending items that need to be resolved while he's away." Mrs. Eleanor stopped the exercises and Mary immediately saw tension take over her body. "What kind of pending items, Camilla?" "Oh, administrative things. Bills, documents, those boring bureaucracies Edward didn't have time to resolve before traveling. Nothing you need to worry about." But there was something in Camilla's tone that did not invite tranquility. Mary remained by Mrs. Eleanor's side, a silent but firm presence, and this clearly bothered the daughter-in-law. Camilla opened the folder and began spreading papers over the coffee table. They were medical documents, credit card bills, bank statements, health insurance forms. She organized them with precise movements, like someone who already knew exactly what she was looking for. "Eleanor, we need to talk about your expenses. Looking here, I see you've been making unnecessary purchases, medications not covered by the plan, expensive private consultations, products that could be replaced by more economical options." Mrs. Eleanor blinked, confused. "But Camilla, those are my usual medications. The doctor prescribed them." "Yes, but we need to be more conscious. Edward works hard to maintain all this, and waste is not acceptable." Camilla's voice was firm, professorial, as if she were explaining something obvious to a stubborn child. Mary felt indignation rise in her throat, but she kept her composure. She knew any interference at that moment could make things worse. But Mrs. Eleanor, to her surprise, responded with a firmness Mary hadn't expected. "Camilla, those expenses are mine. Edward has never complained about them. I have my own income, my pension, my savings." "You had." Camilla's tone changed, becoming colder. "You had. But with age, Eleanor, it's natural for a person to lose the ability to manage money well. That's why Edward asked me to take over these responsibilities. It's for your own good." The silence that followed was charged with tension. Mrs. Eleanor looked at Mary, and in that look was a silent plea for help, but also a resignation that broke the maid's heart. It was the expression of someone who had already lost many battles and knew this would be just one more. "Mary, could you excuse us?" Camilla turned to her with an icy smile. "I need to talk to my mother-in-law about family matters. I'm sure you understand." There was no way to refuse without causing an open confrontation, something Mary knew would only harm Mrs. Eleanor. She nodded, but before leaving she briefly held the elderly woman's hand, squeezing it softly, trying to convey through that simple touch that she was not alone. "I'll be in the kitchen if you need anything, Mrs. Eleanor." When Mary closed the door, she remained outside for a few seconds, her heart beating fast. She could hear the muffled voices through the wood, Camilla's authoritarian tone contrasting with Mrs. Eleanor's increasingly weak responses. Every fibre of her being screamed to go back in there, to intervene, to protect this woman who had become much more than an employer. But she knew she needed to be strategic. One wrong move could cost not only her job but also her ability to be present, to protect Mrs. Eleanor when it was truly necessary. In the kitchen, Mary pretended to be busy organizing cabinets, but her ears were attentive to any sound coming from the living room. 15 minutes passed like 15 hours. When she finally heard the door open, she went to the hallway entrance and saw Camilla leaving, the document folder now fuller than when she had arrived. "Mary, I'm going to need you to adjust Eleanor's routine." The daughter-in-law spoke without looking directly at her, as if giving orders to an inanimate object. "No unnecessary outings, no unauthorized visits. And I want a daily report on everything she does, eats, and says. Understood?" With all due respect, Mrs. Sterling, but my job is to care for Mrs. Eleanor, not to spy on her. Camilla finally turned her face toward her, and in that moment Mary saw the mask slip slightly. There was something cruel in those green eyes, something that enjoyed the power she had just exercised. Your job, Mary, is to do what I tell you. Or do you think it was Edward who hired you? Everything in this house goes through me, everything. And if you want to stay here, I suggest you remember that. Without waiting for a response, Camilla left, leaving behind only the echo of her high heels and the expensive perfume that now smelled more like a threat than elegance. Mary ran to the living room and found Mrs. Eleanor sitting on the sofa, her hands trembling, her face pale. Several documents were still scattered on the table, but some had disappeared. The elderly woman stared into the void, and as Mary approached, she saw silent tears streaming down her face. "Mrs. Eleanor, what happened? What did she say?" "She took papers, Mary. Important documents. She said she needs to reorganize my finances, that Edward is worried about my spending. But I know my son. He never asked me for this. Never." Mary knelt beside the elderly woman, holding her cold hands. "Do you have copies of those documents? Do you know exactly what she took?" Mrs. Eleanor shook her head, helpless. "I did, but they were all together in that folder. Bank information, powers of attorney, even the copy of the will I made a few years ago. She said she needed to review everything, make sure it was all in order. But the way she spoke, Mary, the way she looked at me, it was as if I were a burden, a problem to be solved." Something inside Mary snapped at that moment. She saw the strong, dignified woman she had known falling apart before her eyes, reduced to a shadow of herself by words carefully chosen to wound without leaving visible marks. It was a sophisticated cruelty disguised as family concern, and therefore all the more dangerous. "Mrs. Eleanor, you need to call Mr. Edward. Tell him what is happening." "I can't." The elderly woman's voice was weak, defeated. "He trusts her. He married her. If I cause problems in his marriage, I'll lose him for good. He's my only son, Mary, the only one I have left in the world." And it was in that sentence that Mary understood the true prison Mrs. Eleanor was in. It wasn't the walls of that luxury apartment, nor the advanced age that limited her movements. It was the fear of absolute loneliness, the terror of losing the last family bond she had left. Camilla knew this, and used that knowledge as a sharp, silent weapon. The afternoon turned into night, and Mary remained by Mrs. Eleanor's side, helping her calm down, preparing chamomile tea, speaking softly about simple and comforting things. But in her mind, as she watched the elderly woman finally fall asleep, emotionally exhausted, a certainty was forming like solid rock. This was just the beginning. Camilla had shown her claws, but she was still testing the limits, measuring resistance, and if no one stopped her, if no one had the courage to face her, what would come next would be much worse. Mary looked at the phone on the nightstand, tempted to call Edward immediately, but something held her back. She had no proof, only words against words, and Camilla was too skillful to leave tracks, so she would need to be even more careful, even more vigilant. Every conversation, every gesture, every moment Camilla was present, she would be there, watching, protecting, guarding, because if Mrs. Eleanor no longer had the strength to fight alone, Mary would fight for her, no matter what happened. The days following Edward's departure were like walking on glass. Every morning Mary woke up with a knot in her stomach, not knowing what the day would bring. Camilla had established a routine of daily visits, appearing always in the early afternoon when the sun was strongest, and the apartment seemed even quieter. And with each visit, the atmosphere grew heavier, more oppressive, as if the air itself became harder to breathe. Mrs. Eleanor had visibly changed. The woman who used to smile while telling old stories now spent hours in silence, looking out the window without really seeing anything. She ate little, even when Mary prepared her favorite dishes. She slept poorly. Mary heard her restless footsteps during the night, walking through the hallway like a ghost in her own home. And worst of all was seeing that light that shone in her eyes slowly fading, replaced by a resignation that seemed to age her years in just days. Camilla was methodical in her cruelty. She never screamed, never physically assaulted, but her words were chosen with surgical precision to hit where it hurt most. She commented on how Mrs. Eleanor was getting slower, more forgetful, more dependent. She suggested it might be time to review certain privileges, certain freedoms she still maintained. She talked about financial responsibility, about how much Edward sacrificed to maintain that standard of living, about how it would be fairer if the elderly woman contributed less to the expenses. Every sentence was a small stab wrapped in gift paper. Mary tried to always be present during these visits, but Camilla had the irritating habit of asking her to leave under some pretext. To get something from the kitchen, check if the laundry was dry, organize the bedroom closet. Always something to take her out of the room for a few precious minutes. And in those minutes, Mary knew, things were said that left Mrs. Eleanor more fragile, more scared, more broken. It was on a Thursday, exactly 1 week after Edward's departure, that everything changed. The day dawned unusually hot for that time of year in New York. The sun beat strongly on the penthouse windows, turning the rooms into greenhouses of light and heat. Mrs. Eleanor had spent a particularly difficult night, waking several times with nightmares that left her confused and scared. Mary had stayed by her side until dawn, holding her hand, softly humming songs her grandmother used to sing back in Savannah. By morning, they managed to establish an almost normal routine. They had breakfast on the balcony, and Mrs. Eleanor even managed to smile when Mary told a funny story about a stubborn rooster on her parents' farm. They did the physical therapy exercises, and the elderly woman seemed to be feeling a little better, a little more present. Mary began to hope that perhaps that day would be different, that perhaps Camilla wouldn't show up, that perhaps they could just have one day of peace. But fate, as always, had other plans. Camilla arrived at noon, earlier than usual, and there was something different about her. Her movements were sharper, her voice had a poorly disguised irritation, and her eyes shone with something Mary identified as contained rage. She brought a large bag, and even worse, a folder even fuller of documents than on previous visits. "Eleanor, we need to resolve some important issues today." Camilla's voice was cutting, without the usual disguises of kindness. "Edward called earlier and is worried about certain inconsistencies I found in your records." Mrs. Eleanor, who was sitting on the living room sofa trying to read a magazine, looked up, confused. "What inconsistencies? I don't understand." Camilla threw some papers on the coffee table with a gesture that was almost violent. "Unauthorized spending, signatures on documents you shouldn't have signed, questionable financial decisions. Frankly, Eleanor, I'm starting to question your mental capacity to manage your own affairs." Mary, who was in the kitchen organizing lunch, heard the tone of the conversation and immediately headed for the living room. When she arrived, she saw Mrs. Eleanor trying to get up from the sofa, visibly shaken, her hands trembling as she tried to support herself on the arms of the furniture. "Excuse me, Mrs. Sterling, but I think Mrs. Eleanor needs to rest. She didn't sleep well last night." Camilla turned to Mary, with an expression of pure contempt. "No one asked for your opinion, Mary. In fact, since you're here, go to the kitchen and make some tea, and don't come back until I call." There was something in Camilla's tone that was different this time. It wasn't just authority, it was a threat. Mary looked at Mrs. Eleanor, who avoided her gaze, clearly afraid of making the situation worse. Every instinct screamed for her to stay, but she knew that openly defying Camilla at that moment could have worse consequences. "I'll prepare the tea, but I'll be right there if you need anything." Mary went to the kitchen but left the door ajar. She put the kettle on the stove but kept her ears sharp. She could hear Camilla's voice rising in pitch, hear Mrs. Eleanor trying to explain herself, her voice getting weaker, more frightened. And then she heard something that made her blood run cold. The sound of something heavy being picked up, a sudden movement. Without thinking twice, Mary dropped everything and ran to the living room. What she saw paralyzed her for a fraction of a second that seemed to last an eternity. Mrs. Eleanor was standing, in the middle of the room, clearly off balance, her hands extended in front of her body in a defensive gesture. And Camilla was a few steps from her, holding a wooden exercise rod that was normally kept in the office closet. It was an object used for stretching exercises, cylindrical, made of polished wood, completely harmless in normal circumstances. But in Camilla's hands, raised at that height, pointed at a helpless elderly woman, it transformed into something terrifying. "What are you doing?" Mary managed to say, her voice coming out in a thin thread of sound. Camilla didn't lower the rod immediately. For a few interminable seconds she remained there, her eyes fixed on Mrs. Eleanor, who had begun to tremble visibly. It wasn't to hit her, Mary realized with growing horror. It was to intimidate, to show power, to make it clear who commanded and who obeyed. It was control through terror. "I'm teaching Eleanor about boundaries." Camilla's voice was cold, almost casual, as if she were explaining something obvious. People her age need to understand that they can't just do whatever they want. They need structure, discipline. Mary felt her legs move before her brain could fully process the decision. In 3 steps, she was between Camilla and Mrs. Eleanor, her arms open in a gesture of physical protection. "Put that down now. Please put that down." Camilla smiled, and it was a terrible smile, empty of any humanity. "Or what, Mary? What exactly are you going to do? Call the police? Tell Edward? Who do you think he's going to believe? His wife or a maid he barely knows?" The words were like poison, but Mary didn't move. Her body remained firm between the threat and Mrs. Eleanor, even though she was terrified inside. Behind her she could feel the elderly woman trembling, could hear her quick and irregular breathing, could almost touch the terror emanating from her. "This isn't right." Mary's voice came out firmer than she expected. "You know this isn't right. She is an elderly woman. She is your mother-in-law. She is your husband's mother. How can you do this?" For a moment, something passed over Camilla's face. Perhaps it was guilt, perhaps a flash of conscience, but it disappeared as quickly as it appeared, replaced by that mask of calculated coldness. She slowly lowered the rod, but didn't let go of it completely. She kept it in her hands, stroking the polished wood with her fingers, like someone stroking a weapon. "You don't understand how the world works, Mary." Her voice was now almost pedagogical, as if explaining something complex to a child. "Vulnerable people need to be controlled for their own good. Eleanor is becoming senile. She's making wrong decisions. She's becoming a danger to herself. Someone needs to take control before it's too late." "She is not senile." Mary felt tears of rage and despair burn her eyes. "She is lucid, intelligent, capable. The only thing happening is that you are making her believe she isn't." The silence that followed was charged with explosive tension. Camilla took a step forward, and Mary instinctively backed up, carefully pushing Mrs. Eleanor behind her. It was then that Camilla did something even crueler than raising the rod. With a calculated and cold movement, she dropped it on the floor, where it fell with a dry thud that echoed through the room. Then she leaned in slightly, as if to confide a secret, and spoke loud enough for Mrs. Eleanor to hear. "Eleanor, dear mother-in-law, I think it's time we talked about your future. There are wonderful places for people your age, with professional care, 24-hour nurses, supervised activities, places where you wouldn't be a burden to anyone. Edward is seriously considering this option, you know. He asked me to research. He said he's tired of worrying." "No." The word came from Mrs. Eleanor as a desperate whisper. "Edward wouldn't do that. He wouldn't." Camilla moved closer, and Mary had to use all her willpower not to push her away. "Wouldn't he? Are you sure? When was the last time he actually spent time with you, Eleanor? When was the last time he chose to be here instead of at some meeting on some trip? Do you really think he would hesitate to put you in a place where other people take care of you, freeing him from all this guilt he feels?" The words were pure venom, chosen to destroy, to break the last thread of hope Mrs. Eleanor still held. And they worked. Mary felt the elderly woman's body go limp behind her, heard a sound of a stifled sob, felt the weight of absolute defeat. "Stop it!" Mary screamed, her voice finally breaking the control she had been trying to maintain. "You have no right to say those things. You have no right to destroy her like this." Camilla backed away, but her smile was one of victory. "I wasn't destroying. I was being realistic. And you, Mary, should start looking for another job, because when Eleanor goes where she belongs, you will no longer be needed here." With those words, she picked up her bag, adjusted her hair with a gesture that was pure affectation, and walked toward the door. Before leaving, she turned one last time. "Oh, and just so we're clear, if you try to tell any distorted version of This to Edward. I will make sure you never get a job in New York again. I have contacts, I have influence. One little word from me and you'll be back in the South where you never should have left. The door closed behind her, and the silence that remained was suffocating. Mary turned slowly to Mrs. Eleanor and found her on her knees on the floor, her hands covering her face, her body shaking with silent sobs. The rod remained fallen a few feet away, a silent symbol of everything that had happened. Mary knelt beside her, wrapping her in her arms, feeling the fragile body tremble against hers. "Mrs. Eleanor, I'm sorry. I'm sorry for not stopping this sooner. I'm sorry for not being strong enough." But Mrs. Eleanor didn't respond with words. She just cried, a deep cry that came from a place of accumulated pain, of unspoken fear, of loneliness that all the money in the world couldn't fill. And Mary, holding that woman who represented everything that was still good and dignified in the world, made a decision that would change everything. The consequences no longer mattered. It didn't matter if she lost her job, her roof, her references. It didn't matter if Camilla fulfilled her threats and destroyed her chances of working again. None of that mattered anymore. What mattered was that woman in her arms, trembling with fear and helplessness. What mattered was doing what was right, even if the price was too high. "Mrs. Eleanor, listen to me." Mary held the elderly woman's face gently, forcing her to look into her eyes. "We are going to tell Mr. Edward. We are going to tell him everything. And I will be here by your side no matter what happens. Do you understand me? You are not alone. You will never be alone again as long as I have the strength to prevent it." That night, Mary did not sleep. After calming Mrs. Eleanor and helping her to bed, she remained sitting in the armchair beside the bed, watching the elderly woman's irregular breathing, seeing how her eyes moved rapidly under closed eyelids, signaling troubled dreams. Every time Mrs. Eleanor moved, murmuring incomprehensible words, Mary held her hand, whispering reassuring words, promising protection she barely knew how to provide. Dawn arrived slowly, bringing with it that grey light that precedes daybreak in New York. Mary had made a decision during the dark hours of the night. As soon as the day fully brightened, and it was a reasonable hour in Singapore, she would call Edward. It didn't matter what Camilla had threatened. It didn't matter if he didn't believe her. She had to try. Mrs. Eleanor deserved at least that. It was when she was mentalizing exactly what she would say, how she would explain everything without sounding like she was exaggerating or manipulating the situation, that she heard a sound coming from the living room. Steps, but they weren't the light and hesitant steps of Mrs. Eleanor. They were firm, masculine, decisive steps. Mary's heart raced. Had Camilla sent someone? Was she fulfilling her threat sooner than expected? She got up silently, took her phone and walked to the bedroom door, opening it just a crack. What she saw left her breathless. Edward was standing in the middle of the room, still wearing his travel suit, a suitcase by his side, his face marked by the exhaustion of an international flight. But it wasn't just exhaustion. There was something else in his expression, a deep concern that made his brows furrow as he looked around the apartment. "Mr. Edward?" Mary came out of the room, closing the door carefully so as not to wake Mrs. Eleanor. "You're back? I thought you weren't returning for another 2 weeks." He turned to her, and Mary saw in his eyes an intensity she had never noticed before. "Something was wrong, Mary. I felt it. I tried to call my mother last night several times and she didn't answer. I called Camilla and she said everything was fine, that my mother was just sleeping. But something in her voice, I can't explain it, something bothered me deeply. I cancelled the meetings, took the first available flight, and came straight from the airport." Mary felt tears threaten to well up. It was as if a dam were about to burst inside her, all the accumulated tension of that week pressing to get out. "Mr. Edward, I need to talk to you urgently." He studied her for a moment, noting the deep, dark circles under her eyes, the paleness of her face, the way her hands trembled slightly. "Sit down, Mary. Tell me everything." And she told him. She started from the first day after his departure, when Camilla began to take control of Mrs. Eleanor's documents. She spoke about the daily visits that left the elderly woman increasingly shaken, about the cruel comments disguised as concern, about how Camilla had taken important papers from the house. And then, With her voice breaking, she told him about the day before, about the rod, about the veiled threats, about how Mrs. Eleanor had collapsed afterward. Edward listened to everything in absolute silence. His expression changed with each revelation. Initial incredulity giving way to contained rage, then to guilt, and finally to something that looked like deep pain. When Mary finished, he remained silent for long seconds, his hands interlaced in front of his body, his breathing heavy. I knew it. The words came out like a forced confession. I knew something was wrong. I always knew. In the last 2 years, I noticed small things. The way Camilla spoke about my mother when she thought I wasn't paying attention. Subtle comments about how it would be easier if we didn't have to worry about her. Looks that lasted a second longer than they should have. But I ignored them. I told myself I was imagining things, that it was just work stress making me see problems where none existed. He stood up abruptly and walked to the window, looking at the city starting to wake up below. And do you know what's worse, Mary? Part of me didn't want to see. Because if I saw, I would have to do something about it. I would have to confront Camilla. I would have to admit I made a wrong choice. I would have to admit I put my mother in danger by marrying that woman. It was easier to pretend everything was fine. Mary approached slowly. You are here now. That is what matters. I'm late. His voice was heavy with remorse. How much damage has already been done? How many nights did my mother spend in fear in her own house while I was on the other side of the world closing deals? Before Mary could respond, they heard a sound from the bedroom. Mrs. Eleanor had woken up. Edward headed there immediately, and Mary followed him. When they opened the door, they found the elderly woman sitting in bed, her eyes wide, her expression confused to see her son there. Edward, you're back? But I thought... Mom. He knelt beside the bed, holding her hands gently. Forgive me. Please forgive me for everything. Mrs. Eleanor looked at him, then at Mary, trying to understand what was happening. Her face still bore the marks of a poorly slept night, and her eyes were swollen from crying. Forgive you? But son, you didn't do anything. I did. I did the worst thing a son can do. I left you vulnerable. I left you alone with someone who should never have entered this family. It was then that the front door opened. Camilla had arrived using her keys as she always did, ready for another day of visiting. Her high heels announced her presence even before she appeared in the hallway. When she entered the room and saw Edward there, her face went through a quick series of expressions. Surprise, nervousness, and then that mask of the worried wife she wore so well. Edward, darling, you're back. Why didn't you let me know? I would have picked you up at the airport. She approached to kiss him, but he pulled away, slowly rising from his kneeling position beside his mother's bed. Camilla, we need to talk. His voice was cold, controlled, but there was a current of rage just below the surface. She blinked, confused by the tone. Of course, love, about what? About what you've been doing here in my absence, about how you treated my mother, about the documents you took, about yesterday. Camilla's face changed subtly. The mask didn't fall completely, but it cracked at the edges. I don't know what you're talking about. I came every day to take care of Eleanor, just as you asked me. It was hard. She's getting more confused, harder to deal with, but I tried to do my best. Mary took a step forward. That is not true, you know it isn't. Camilla turned to her with eyes that flashed lightning. Ah, now I understand. She turned her gaze back to Edward. The maid filled your head with lies, didn't she? I warned you this would happen. She's obsessed with your mother, wants to make herself indispensable, probably has her eye on some kind of financial reward. Stop. Edward's voice cut through the air like a blade. Stop lying, Camilla. I spoke with Mary. I heard everything. And before you continue with this narrative, I want you to tell me exactly what you said to my mother yesterday, word for word. Camilla hesitated. It was the first time Mary had seen her genuinely insecure. I don't remember exactly. They were normal conversations about care, about responsibilities. You picked up a rod. Edward took a step toward her. You picked up a rod and scared a 73-year-old woman, my mother. And then you said things about putting her in an institution. Tell me, Camilla, did I ever ask you to research that? Did I ever suggest I wanted to get rid of my own mother? The silence that followed was deafening. Camilla opened her mouth to respond, closed it again, and then her expression changed completely. The mask fell. What remained was pure rage, unfiltered. You want to know the truth, Edward? The truth is, I'm tired. Tired of pretending I like her. Tired of coming here and having to act like I care. Tired of this whole happy family charade. Your mother has always been a weight, always an obstacle. And yes, I picked up that rod. Not to hit her, but to show who's in charge here. To make it clear she is nothing more than an inconvenient old woman who is in the way. Eleanor is nothing to you. Edward could barely control his voice. She is my mother. She is the woman who raised me, who built everything I have today. How dare you speak of her like that? Because it's the truth, Camilla practically screamed. And you know what else is true? You never really loved her. If you did, you wouldn't spend more time at the office than here. If you did, you wouldn't need a maid to take care of her. You are as absent as I am indifferent. The difference is I'm honest about it. The words fell like bombs in the room. Mrs. Eleanor began to cry silently, and Mary immediately went to her, hugging her. Edward stood still, his face pale, as if he had been punched in the stomach. You're right. His voice came out low, broken. You're absolutely right. I failed as a son. I chose work, I chose career, I chose everything except being present when she needed me most. But that doesn't give you the right to mistreat her. That doesn't give you the right to terrorize her in her own home. Camilla crossed her arms, her face a mask of contempt. And what are you going to do about it, Edward? Divorce me? Well, I hope you're prepared for the legal battle ahead. I have excellent lawyers. I have connections. And I have proof that you neglected your mother for years. I can turn this against you so easily. Edward took a step back as if he needed physical distance from that woman he thought he knew. Leave, now. Get your things and get out of this house. With pleasure. Camilla turned, but before leaving she cast one last venomous look at everyone in the room. But this isn't over. Not even. Close, you'll regret this. When the door slammed behind her, the silence that remained was different. It wasn't peace but relief, as if a suffocating weight had been removed from the air. Edward went back to his mother, kneeling again beside the bed. Mom, I'm so sorry, so much. I'm going to do better. I promise I'm going to do better. Mrs. Eleanor, with tears streaming down her face, held her son's face with her trembling hands. Son, you came back. That's what matters. You came back. But there was one last thing that needed to be resolved. Edward turned. To Mary. You saved my mother. When I failed, when I was absent, when I closed my eyes to what was happening, you stayed. You protected her. How can I ever thank you for that? Mary shook her head. You don't need to thank me, Mr. Edward. I did what any decent person would do. No. His voice was firm. Many people wouldn't. Many people would choose silence, the security of the job, the fear of confrontation. But you chose what was right, even risking everything. And I will never forget that. It was then that Edward remembered something. Camilla took documents from here, you said. Mary, do you know where she kept them? No, but she mentioned she needed to reorganize Mrs. Eleanor's finances. Maybe she left something around here. They began to search, first in the living room, then in the office. It was Mrs. Eleanor, still fragile but wanting to help, who remembered. The closet. She always kept things in the guest room closet. She said no one looked there. Edward opened the closet and, hidden under old blankets, found a box. Inside it, documents that revealed much more than they expected. Medications with expired prescriptions that had never been renewed, medical reports of exams that should have been delivered to Edward, but were intercepted by Camilla, and a document that made his blood run cold. An admission form for an elderly care institution, already partially filled out with Mrs. Eleanor's data, dated 3 months ago. She was planning this for a long time. Edward held the papers with trembling hands. While I trusted her, while I thought I was leaving my mother in good hands, she was systematically building a case to take her out of here. Mary looked at the documents and felt nauseous. It was worse than she had imagined. It wasn't just momentary cruelty. It was planned, calculated negligence, executed bit by bit so no one would notice until it was too late. But there was one more thing in the box, a copy of Mrs. Eleanor's will, with markings and notes in the margins made by Camilla. And one specific clause was circled in red, the one that determined Mary should remain as Mrs. Eleanor's caregiver under any circumstances, a protection the elderly woman herself had secretly inserted months ago, as if she sensed that one day she would need someone she could trust unconditionally. The days following Camilla's departure were like waking from a prolonged nightmare. The penthouse, which for so long had seemed like a golden prison where fear hung invisible between the walls, slowly began to transform back into a home. But recovery would not be quick or simple. Psychological wounds take time to heal, and Mrs. Eleanor carried deep marks that went beyond what any medicine could cure. Edward cancelled all his trips and appointments for the next 2 months. For the first time in years, he put family above business, delegating responsibilities to trusted partners and using technology to participate in meetings remotely. His mornings now began not with urgent calls from investors, but with coffee on the balcony beside his mother, listening to stories he realized he had neglected for too long. There was a constant guilt in his eyes, a weight Mary knew would take years for him to fully process. Mrs. Eleanor, for her part, oscillated between moments of surprising lucidity and episodes of emotional confusion. Sometimes she woke up in the middle of the night, scared, calling for Mary with a trembling voice, certain that Camilla had returned. Other times, she sat in silence, for hours looking at nothing, lost in thoughts she couldn't or wouldn't share. Mary remained always nearby, a constant and comforting presence, holding her hand when the tremors returned, whispering soft words when nightmares visited her. It was a week after Camilla's expulsion that the first unexpected development happened. Edward was in the office organizing papers when he received a call that left him visibly perturbed. It was Robert, his younger brother, whom he hadn't spoken to in nearly 5 years. Their relationship had deteriorated after Robert publicly questioned some of Edward's business decisions, accusing him of becoming so obsessed with money that he had forgotten the values their parents tried to teach. The ensuing argument was so intense that the brothers cut contact, meeting only on mandatory dates like Christmas, where they exchanged cold and distant greetings. Edward put the phone on speaker, and Mary, who was in the adjacent room, could hear Robert's voice. It was a voice similar to his brother's but carried a different intensity, rawer, more direct. "Edward, I got a strange call today. Someone told me about problems involving Mom and your wife. Or rather your ex-wife, from what I understand. Is it true?" Edward took a deep breath before responding. "It's true. Camilla was mistreating Mum. I was traveling. I didn't see the signs, and when I got back, it was almost too late." There was a long pause on the other side of the line. "I warned you about her, Edward. Remember? At your wedding, I told you there was something wrong with that woman. But you didn't want to listen. You said I was jealous, that it was envy of your success." "I know." Edward's voice was heavy with remorse. "You were right. About her, about me, about everything, I became exactly what you said I would. A rich, lonely man who forgot what really matters." Another silence. Then Robert spoke again, and this time his voice was softer. "I'm coming back to New York. I need to see Mom. And we need to talk, you and I, about many things." When Robert arrived 2 days later, Mary immediately saw the similarities and differences between the brothers. Robert was a bit shorter than Edward, wore a beard, and had a more casual style, jeans and a button-down shirt instead of his brother's impeccable suit. But it was in the eyes that the difference was most striking. Where Edward carried guilt and weariness, Robert brought a burning intensity, a passion for justice he had never lost despite his disappointments. He hugged Mrs. Eleanor with a tenderness that brought tears to the elderly woman's eyes. "Mum, forgive me for staying away. I was angry at Edward, but I ended up punishing you too. That was unfair." Mrs. Eleanor held her younger son's face in her hands. "My boy, you are here now. Both of you are here. That's all that matters." But Robert hadn't come just to reconcile. He brought information that changed the perspective of everything. As a lawyer specializing in family law and the protection of vulnerable people, he had researched Camilla as soon as he heard what happened, and what he discovered was disturbing. Edward, Camilla is not a beginner at this. Robert spread documents over the living room table. She has a pattern. Before you, she was married twice. Both husbands were older men, widowers with elderly parents. In both cases, the elderly parents were eventually placed in institutions, and Camilla ended up with access to significant portions of the inheritance through strategically planned divorce settlements. Edward turned pale. "Ah, you saying she chose me specifically because I had an elderly mother?" "I'm saying she has a modus operandi. Marry successful men who neglect their families, gain trust, isolate the elderly, create situations that justify institutionalizing them, and then profit from it. It's calculated, meticulous, and worse yet technically legal in most cases." Mary, listening to that, felt a chill down her spine. Mrs. Eleanor was right all along. It wasn't paranoia. It wasn't mental confusion. It was the survival instinct of someone facing a predator. Then a registered letter arrived. It was anonymous, but the content was explosive. A woman named Clara, who had worked as Mrs. Eleanor's caregiver 2 years prior, wrote in detail about how she had been pressured by Camilla to ignore certain needs of the elderly woman, to falsely report on her mental state, and to participate in a narrative that Mrs. Eleanor was losing the capacity to care for herself. When Clara refused and threatened to tell Edward, she was fired under false accusations of theft. She had remained silent for fear of retaliation, but upon hearing rumors that Camilla had finally been exposed, she found the courage to speak. Edward read the letter. Aloud, and with every paragraph, his expression grew darker. When he finished, he looked at his mother with eyes full of tears. "How many people tried to warn me? How many signs did I ignore?" Robert placed a hand on his brother's shoulder. "What matters now is what you do from here. And I suggest we prepare ourselves, because Camilla will not accept this defeat easily." He was right. A week later, Camilla's lawyers made contact. She was filing a defamation lawsuit against Edward and Mary, claiming they had conspired to destroy her reputation with false accusations. She demanded substantial financial compensation and half of the marital assets, including a percentage of Mrs. Eleanor's future inheritance, based on clauses in the prenuptial agreement she had skillfully manipulated years before. The legal battle would stretch for months, Robert explained, but they had something Camilla didn't expect: concrete proof, the hidden documents, Clara's testimony, and now also the pattern of behavior in previous marriages. Furthermore, Robert had managed to contact one of Camilla's former mothers-in-law, an 80-year-old lady who was still traumatized by the experience and was willing to testify. As the legal aspects unfolded, life in the penthouse began to find a new rhythm. Edward hired a therapist specializing in psychological trauma to work with Mrs. Eleanor. The sessions were difficult, often leaving the elderly woman emotionally exhausted, but gradually she began to process what she had lived through, naming the fears that were once too big to be spoken aloud. Mary participated in some of these sessions at Mrs. Eleanor's request, and it was during one of them that the therapist made an important observation. Mrs. Eleanor didn't just suffer from the recent trauma with Camilla. She carried years of accumulated loneliness, of feeling like a burden to her son, of believing her value had diminished with age. Camilla only exploited wounds that already existed. Edward, present at that specific session, had to leave the room in the middle to compose himself. When he returned, his eyes were red. "I spent years building an empire, closing million-dollar deals, being recognized in business magazines. But I failed at the only thing that really mattered, making my mother feel loved and valued." "It's not too late," the therapist said gently. "Regret is only useful if it leads to change." And Edward changed. Not overnight, but consistently, day after day. He reorganized his entire life, refusing to return to the insane pace from before. He began having lunch with his mother every day, listening to her talk about her old dreams, about what she would like to do with the time she still had. And together they began to make lists, places she wanted to visit, recipes she wanted to learn to make again, books she wanted to read. The relationship between Edward and Robert also healed gradually. They spent long nights talking, sometimes arguing, but always with honesty. Robert helped Edward see how the pursuit of financial success had become an escape from emotional vulnerability. Edward helped Robert understand that not all success was empty, that it was possible to have both, professional fulfillment and meaningful human connections. It was during one of those nights of conversation, when both had already had a few glasses of wine and their defenses were low, that Robert finally opened his heart about something that had tormented him for years. "Edward, I need to tell you something I never had the courage to say. When Dad passed away, I was so lost, so scared. You were the oldest, the strong one, the one who took over. Everything without blinking. I admired you so much for that, but I also hated you a little. Because you seemed to need no one, you showed no weakness, while I was falling apart inside." Edward looked at his brother with surprise. "I was falling apart too, Robert. The difference is I learned to hide it well. Someone had to keep everything running, keep the company on its feet, take care of the bills. So I swallowed my pain and moved on. But that cost me. It cost me my ability to feel, to connect. I became an efficient but empty machine." The brothers hugged that night, crying together for the first time since their father's funeral 15 years earlier. It was as if a wall that had been built brick by brick over decades finally collapsed, allowing them to go back to being just two brothers who loved each other, who had lost their way but now had the chance to rebuild something true. Mrs. Eleanor, witnessing that reconciliation, felt something inside her heal as well. For years, she had carried the guilt of not being able to keep her sons together after her husband's death. Now, seeing them sitting, side by side on the balcony, laughing at old memories and planning the future together, she realized that sometimes families need to break completely to be able to rebuild themselves in a stronger and more authentic way. And Mary, at the center of all that, remained as the anchor that kept the family united. Mrs. Eleanor had insisted the will be formally updated, including clear provisions that guaranteed not only that Mary would remain as her caregiver, but that she would be treated as a member of the family in every sense. Edward went further, offering Mary a substantial salary increase, a larger and more comfortable room in the apartment, and the promise that she would never again have to fear for her position or security. But for Mary, the true payment was not in the money. It was in the silent moments on the balcony with Mrs. Eleanor, when the elderly woman would hold her hand and say, "You saved me." It was in the genuine smiles that began to return to a face once so sad. It was in knowing she had made the right choice, even when it seemed impossible. 6 months after the day everything exploded, life had found a new balance. The case against Camilla was moving forward, and Robert's lawyers were confident she would not only lose, but face legal consequences for negligence and psychological abuse. The former mothers-in-law from her previous marriages had formed a united front, sharing their stories and creating a case that was impossible to ignore. Mrs. Eleanor, though she still carried emotional scars, was visibly better. Her smile returned, her voice regained strength, and she began participating in activities she had abandoned, like her book club and watercolor painting classes. Edward hired a physical therapist who came 3 times a week, and physical improvement accompanied emotional recovery. But perhaps the most significant change was in how they related to each other. It was no longer a dysfunctional family held together only by obligation and guilt. It was a family that had faced its darkest side and actively chosen to do differently. Edward learned to say no to work when his presence was needed at home. Robert began to visit regularly, bringing with him a lightness everyone had forgotten was possible. And Mary, who had arrived at that house as a maid, was now treated and loved like a daughter. On a Sunday afternoon, nearly a year after everything had begun, they were all gathered on the balcony. Edward had prepared a barbecue, something he used to do when he was younger, but had abandoned in the rush of corporate life. Robert played the guitar, an instrument he had learned as a teenager and recently rediscovered. Mrs. Eleanor was sitting in the most comfortable chair, a blanket over her legs despite the heat, smiling as she watched her sons. Mary brought a pitcher of lemonade she had prepared, and when she sat down, Mrs. Eleanor held her hand. "You know, Mary, sometimes I think everything happened for a reason. If it weren't for Camilla, as terrible as it was, Edward would never have woken up. Robert would never have come back. And you would never have become part of this family the way you are now." Mary squeezed her hand back, feeling tears wanting to well up but keeping them under control. "I don't know if I believe bad things happen for a reason, Mrs. Eleanor, but I believe we can choose what to do with them. And you chose love. You chose change. That is what matters." Edward raised his glass of juice, a toast to second chances, to imperfect families that choose to get better, and to brave people like Mary who remind us of what it really means to protect someone. Everyone raised their glasses, and in that moment, with the sun setting over Manhattan and dyeing the sky in shades of orange and pink, Mary felt something she hadn't felt in a long time, the absolute certainty that she was exactly where she was supposed to be. The months that followed brought the conclusion of the legal process. Camilla was found guilty of emotional negligence and psychological abuse. She lost all rights to Edward's inheritance and was ordered to pay substantial compensation, not only to Mrs. Eleanor, but also to the victims of her previous marriages. Furthermore, she was included in a registry of people barred from working with the elderly or vulnerable. Robert, who led the case with tireless passion, turned that victory into a larger cause, starting to work on legislation to better protect the elderly from psychological abuses that leave no physical marks but destroy lives. Mrs. Eleanor used part of the compensation to create a fund that helped domestic workers report abuse, without fear of retaliation. The fund bore Mary's name, something the young woman tried to refuse but eventually accepted when she realized how much it meant to the elderly woman to be able to turn her pain into something that would help others. Edward never fully returned to his previous frenetic pace. He learned to delegate, to trust his team, and to understand that being present was more important than being at the top. His relationship with his mother flourished in ways he never imagined possible. They traveled together, visited places she always wanted to see, and Edward discovered that seeing the world through her eyes was infinitely more rewarding than any corporate achievement. And Mary remained, no longer as a maid, but as an essential part of that reconstructed family. She brought her parents from Savannah to visit her, and Mrs. Eleanor received them with genuine affection, insisting they stay at the apartment and treating them like family. The house that was once a silent mausoleum of empty wealth transformed into a home full of laughter, heated discussions about sports between Edward and Robert, cooking classes with Mrs. Eleanor teaching old recipes to Mary, and Sunday afternoons where the family gathered, not out of obligation but by choice. For Mary, that transformation had an even deeper meaning. She had arrived in New York at 28, scared and insecure, carrying only a suitcase and the dream of building a better life. She had worked in 3 different houses before arriving at the Sterling residence, always treated with indifference, always invisible, always just another piece in the domestic machinery. There were moments when she almost gave up, almost went back to Savannah, accepting that perhaps she wasn't made for the big city. But Mrs. Eleanor saw her for real, not as a function, but as a person. And when the time came to choose between her own safety and doing what was right, Mary discovered within herself a courage she didn't know she possessed. That decision to stand between Camilla and Mrs. Eleanor didn't just change the elderly woman's life, it changed hers too. It proved to herself that she was worth more than people always believed she was worth, that her voice had power, that her presence mattered. Years later, when Mrs. Eleanor finally rested in peace at 82, surrounded by everyone she loved, she held Mary's hand one last time and whispered, "You were the daughter I gained when I needed one most. Thank you for being brave when I couldn't be." Her eyes, though aged and tired, shone with a peace that only comes to those who lived, loved and protected until their last breath. And Mary, with tears streaming down her face, whispered back, "Thank you for teaching me that family isn't just blood. It's choice, it's love, it's mutual protection." The story of Mrs. Eleanor, Edward, Robert and Mary became known far beyond that penthouse in Manhattan. It was shared in support circles for the elderly, used as an example in seminars on the rights of the vulnerable, and inspired others to have the courage to report abuses that previously seemed impossible to face. Because in the end, that wasn't just the story of a brave maid who protected a helpless elderly woman. It was the story of how love, even when tested to the extreme, can prevail. It was about second chances, about families that choose to rebuild themselves, about the strength we find when we decide to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And above all, it was a reminder that sometimes the most invisible person in the room is the only one with enough courage to do what is right, even when the price seems too high to pay. The end. Dear listeners, we hope the story of Mrs. Eleanor, Edward, and Mary has touched your heart deeply. If you were moved by this journey of courage, love, and family reconstruction, leave your like, subscribe to the channel, and tell us in the comments what marked you most in this story. Every day, we bring intense narratives like this one, which reveal the deepest side of the human soul and remind us that even in the darkest moments, the light of hope and dignity can prevail. We'll see you in the next episode.